Good morning. Welcome to Women of Courage. This morning I'm wearing my Woman's Vote shirt because I'm going to tell a story about a woman who became very influential in the women's and Native American rights movement, who spent some time here in the Uinta Basin. I'm going to go back over to this side so that you can see. The story today we're going to tell is about Zitkala Sa, who was actually born with the name of, I want to make sure I get this right, Gertrude, and her last name was Simmons. She was a full-blooded Sioux, and for some reason they gave her an English name. They had an English name. When she got older, she started going by Zitkala Sa, which is a Sioux word which means red bird. And that was what she went by as she wrote her writings through her life. She wanted to be known as Zitkala Sa. And so today we'll be calling her Zitkala Sa. She was born in South Dakota and lived on the reservation there. And her life has a very interesting story. I have a little book that I purchased about her because previous to the Better Days 2020 in Utah, I did not know about Zitkala Sa and about her story that connects to the Uinta Basin. And so I'm going to use that story a little bit because it really gives you an idea of who she was, where she came from, and why she became an advocate for her people. I'm going to flip the camera so you can see. And I'm just going to read right from the book, the very first page, so that you can get a flavor of the way she thought and how her world changed. I remember the day I lost my spirit, and it was in 1884. It was not the day that missionaries came to our Indian village to take me and my friends to their Eastern boarding school, nor was it the night that we reached the school grounds where my body trembled more from fear than from snow I trod upon. It was late that next morning when my friend Juwin overheard talk of cutting our long, heavy hair. "No, I will not submit. I will struggle first," I said. I crept up the stairs as quietly as I could in my new squeaky shoes. I found a large room with 3 white beds and crawled under the one in the darkest corner. Loud voices called my name, and a woman entered the room. I watched them open closet doors and peep behind large trunks. Someone threw up the curtains and the room filled with light. I remember being dragged out, kicking and scratching. They carried me down the stairs and tied me fast in a chair. I cried and shook my head wildly until I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck. Then my keepers gnawed off my thick braids, cut my hair into a shingled style that labeled me a coward. I lost my spirit that day. I could not know that it would rise again, stronger and wiser for the wounds it had suffered. The book goes on to tell the story of how she lived with her people and had the life of a child, they would play trading games and try to be just like their mothers, trading their shoes and their belts and their moccasins and their belts and their clothes, trying to act like grown-up women. The Quakers came to her school or to her village and offered them a chance to go to the white world to experience their teaching, their rules, their way of life. And she begged her mother to be able to go. She had dreams of eating apples. When she got to the school, as you heard in the first paragraph, they cut her hair. She started wearing the clothes of the whites. She lost her language. She lost a lot of things that she had grown up to do and was learning new things. It was a routine. They were trying to teach them to become maids and to be able to survive in the world of the white people. But one thing that she found that she absolutely loved was music. And she learned how to play the violin and the piano and was very successful in her studies and was able to start teaching music to children. And in the end, she went to schools and academies that taught her. The Earlham College was one place where she went. There, she never was able to graduate because she got ill at the end of her studies. But she was able to play in a concert, and she talks about how she was at one point really worried that she wouldn't be accepted, but how the girls all surrounded her and gave her roses, which was such a surprise to her and such a joy. Later, she was doing oratory work, and there was actually someone in the crowd that put up a huge sign that said "Squaw," making her very nervous. But when she finished her oratory, and it was a contest, she talked about her native life and what they had lost. And she said that these people just kind of dropped the sign in their laps, looking dumbfounded when she actually won one of the prizes in that contest. And her words had been so persuasive that it made a lot of difference. So she goes on to make an impact in the world with her music and her oratory. She finally goes back to her native land. She finds that she's caught between two worlds. She isn't sure and doesn't understand how to handle the difference between the white world, where she had gotten her education, and the world that her people lived in. And she felt like she had sort of left behind something that was really important. And so when she got back, she refused to wear her clothes that were more white-oriented clothes and went back to traditional dress. And during that time, she met her husband. His last name was Bowen, and she married him, and then she became known as Mrs. Bowen. And it's here where I start to find out her story from a local perspective in the Uinta Basin. her husband and she were received jobs at the Uinta Ute reservation and worked for the tribe for 14 years here in White Rocks area. He was a clerk and then became superintendent of schools, and she worked in the office. We have a picture of her in the office there. So that's she there on the telephone answering calls at the agency. She was also, they also had a son while they were there. And interestingly, I found their son's obituary, and he must have come back to the basin after they left. They went to Washington, D.C. and became activists in women's rights and also tribal Native rights. And her son actually died right here in the basin, so his growing up years here must have drawn him back, because this is where he came after he left home. One of the things that I read here in our paper in 1912, so I believe they made it here in about 1980s, late 1980s. And in 1912, she wrote, or this was written in the paper, Mrs. Bowen, who is a full-blood Sioux, is a graduate of the New England Conservatory of Music, plays with the finish of an artist on either the violin or the piano. The idea has been uppermost in her mind for years to collect and perpetuate a musical form, sweet melodies played among the American Indians, as well as to preserve the tales, the legends, and the ceremonies of her people. Mrs. Bowen gives assurances that in true Indian life there is a world of beauty and of strength, quite unknown and unappreciated by the people of today, which will be revealed in an upcoming opera. And so, though they were working as BIA employees, she was also pursuing her music during that time. There was a man in Vernal at the time, his name was Hanson, who was a graduate of the BYU Academy, and he was working at the academy here in Vernal, and he was a great musician, and together they collaborated and they wrote an opera. They named it The Sundance, and they produced it and brought it here. The very first showing of this show was here in Vernal at the Imperial Hall, and I so wish that Imperial Hall was still here. It was a fabulous building for cultural events that was here in the early days of the Vernal area. This was where they did many dances, they showed movies, they did plays, they just were able to have their cultural life in this building. It was on springs, and it had, well, the dance floor was on springs, and it would move up and down when you would dance. And there's little stories of kids who would crawl underneath and get money from underneath the floor, because when people would dance, their money would fall out, and the spring floor would make the money roll down to the bottom. But it's got its own story, but I love the story of the Imperial Hall. Well, the first production of the Sundance Opera was there in the Imperial Hall, and these are the members of the cast. We do know that there were some Ute tribal members who played parts in the opera. There were probably others that were from the community that also gathered in. There's a little bit closer picture of the different participants right here. It was a huge success. They were only planning to show it for 2 nights. It turned out that they had such success that they had to do a 3rd night. And it had a high acclaim. Actually, there were newspapermen who came from areas out on the Wasatch Front. I believe it was the Desert News that had an article about them, and they actually asked for them to produce it in other places in Utah, one of them being BYU, and eventually it was also shown out in Washington, D.C. Quite the success story for Zitkala Sa. She went ahead and followed her husband out to Washington, D.C., and they worked together in many different ways, lobbying for, by that time, women had rights, but it was not until later that the Native Americans were given the right to vote. They were actually given the right to vote. The Citizenship Act became law on June the 24th, or the June of 1924. But it wasn't until February of 1957 that the Uinta Reservation was given the right to vote in the state of Utah. Because they were considered a sovereign nation and separate from the state of Utah resisted having them actually be able to vote in their political party system. So that's a long time, February 14th, 1957. She was influential in the other states and everywhere trying to get that right. So we could say that she was one of the people who helped make that happen. She's in our display of influential women in the voting suffragist movement. She was a suffragist even back when she was in school in her early days of going to school. When she was in college, she actually was in a debate about the rights for women to vote. So she was an advocate of equal rights for people. She did become an author, and her the one that I showed you is an adaptation of her stories written by a contemporary company of writers, and they have taken her words and paraphrased them for children. But it's really a fun book. I would like, and I plan to in the future, to get books that tell more about her story. She passed away in 1938, and at the time she was still lobbying for Native suffrage rights. I hope you enjoyed the story of Zitkala Sa, who had an influence upon the Uinta County area. See you next week.